Okay. I'm a little nervous that I am not in line with the horizon and then I'm going to be tilted later, but we're just going to find out. So I am sitting in my car. I have my webcam balancing on my steering wheel, and I'm using the integrated microphone on my computer. So I have the most professional setup that ever was. Just kidding. However, when inspiration strikes, at least for me, like I kind of gotta run with it and see where it takes me because otherwise I'll overthink it, I'll put it off, and it won't happen. So here we are. And you're probably gonna see me if you're watching me. You'll probably see me looking down from time to time. I do have my laptop in front of me because I'm gonna read a few definitions, and I don't want to get those wrong. So, that being said, let me pull those up. Okay, so hi, it's just me today, Rachel, one of your co-hosts. And in this episode, I wanted to share a little bit more about my personal lived experience with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. This is kind of the original diagnosis that I identified with as being neurodivergent. And it's something that still impacts me on a daily basis. And I think it's something that's really kind of misunderstood by the general public. And so I feel like my voice and my experience around this is valuable. So this is not me talking as a therapist. This is not me as a mental health therapist recommending treatment. This is me as a neurodivergent human sharing like what my experience has been like. So before I get too much into my personal experience, I just kind of want to read to you what the definition of obsessive compulsive disorder is. And I do want to let you know that I'm getting this from the International OCD Foundation. I haven't vetted OCD sources the way that I have with other neurodivergent conditions, which is actually quite surprising. Um, but also not surprising because a lot of times I just like to avoid thinking and talking about OCD, um, because it has caused me a lot of distress. So that being said, if International OCD Foundation turns out to not actually be great, I'm unaware of that at this point. So I'm doing the best I can in this moment. So obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a mental health disorder that affects people of all ages and all walks of life. And it occurs when a person gets caught in a cycle of obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions, the O in OCD, are unwanted, intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that trigger intensely distressing feelings. Compulsions, on the other hand, the C in OCD, are the behaviors that individuals engage in an attempt to get rid of or decrease the obsessions or the distress that goes along with it. So most people at some point in their life will have some sort of obsessive or compulsive behavior or like intrusive thoughts, but that doesn't mean that we all are kind of OCD or all have some OCD. In order for a diagnosis of OCD to be made, right, these cycles of obsessions and compulsions must be extreme to the point that it's consuming a significant period of time, causes intense distress, and gets in the way of your daily life and well-being. Okay, taking a quick pause because someone just pulled up next to me and I'm self-conscious. So I'm going to use this as a break to have a sip of my boba tea. My Friday boba tea. Treat yourself. Few things I enjoy more than the boba. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about obsessions. So obsessions, and again, I'm getting a lot of this information from the International OCD Foundation, and I'm reading directly from that because it is helpful for me with really intense or triggering topics to have a script to be able to read. And instead of reinventing the wheel, I figured I would just read this part of it to you, and then I'll get into my personal experience later. So obsessions are thoughts, images, or impulses that occur usually over and over again and they feel outside of that person's control. Folks with OCD do not want to have these thoughts, and they often find them very disturbing. And in most cases, folks with OCD will understand that those thoughts are illogical or irrational. Obsessions are typically accompanied by intense and uncomfortable feelings like fear, disgust, uncertainty, and doubt, or a feeling that things have to be done in just the right way. So in context of OCD, obsessions are time-consuming and they get in the way of important activities that the person values. That last part is extremely important to keep in mind. In part, it determines whether someone has OCD, a psychological disorder, rather than an obsessive personality trait. And I'm not going to get into obsessive compulsive personality disorder because I do not have enough information or lived experience on that. But just recognize that that is something distinct from obsessive compulsive disorder as a mental health disorder. Okay, compulsions. So compulsions are repetitive behaviors or thoughts that a person uses with the intention of either neutralizing, counteracting, or making their obsessions go away altogether. So people with OCD realize this is only a temporary solution, but without a better way to cope, we rely on compulsions nonetheless. So compulsions can include avoiding situations that trigger obsessions. They are time consuming and get in the way of important activities that the person values. Okay, what do we want to talk about now? Pause, pause, tea time. Okay, so talking more about obsessions, I wanted to give a few examples of common types of obsessions, because I think that the most commonly talked about and understood type of obsession is like a contamination obsession or an obsession with touching something that's dirty or unintentionally ingesting something that'll make you sick, or obsession with things being in a certain order or being clean. And while these are real obsessions that some people with OCD do have, it's certainly not the only one. So contamination obsessions are one. A lot of folks experience violent obsessions, so obsessions about hurting themselves or others, or otherwise doing something that would cause pain or abuse to another. Responsibility obsessions, so fear of being responsible for a terrible thing that could happen or has happened. Sometimes we'll talk about this like as magical thinking. Like if I do this certain behavior, I will be responsible for that person dying. An example that I have from my personal experience is I used to truly believe that if I stepped in on any sort of crack, I would be directly responsible for causing my mother's death. And that went like, it took this idea of don't step on a crack because you'll break your mother's back, which is just this like weird saying, to this deeply rooted responsibility obsession that infiltrated into other different obsessions and behaviors that could then somehow cause and then thus have me be responsible for the demise of a loved one. So perfectionism related obsessions are also a thing. So this could be excessive concern about evenness or exactness, performing something in an exactly perfect way or a way that feels just right. Fear of losing or forgetting important information that they know, or accidentally throwing something out. fear of making mistakes. So as I'm talking about a lot of these things, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I've had all of those thoughts before. And you probably have at some point or another. And maybe you are a person listening to this who does have OCD, but more likely than not, you're a normal human being who's experienced intrusive thoughts because they care about others and they care about themselves. Everyone has intrusive thoughts, but if the intrusive thoughts are taking over such a large portion of your life and causing such a significant level of distress and are often tied in this loop of compulsions, that's when it becomes not just a normal human experience, but more so a mental illness. Um, so other obsessions could be sexual obsessions, so unwanted thoughts or mental images relating to sex or sexual abuse. Pedophilia can be a very common sexual obsession. Religious and moral obsessions. This is sometimes often called scrupulosity. So this is fear of offending God, damnation, or concern about blasphemy, excessive concern of right and wrong, or avoiding sin. Um, Other obsessions, I don't see mine listed on here, so which makes me kind of sad. So I'm going to talk about it and add it to this list because it should be on there. But health anxiety, health-related obsessions. This can look like fear of intense fear of an unknown or undiagnosed illness, responsibility, which I guess it kind of ties into the responsibility obsession, but responsibility over preserving and maintaining your health and what you put into your body. So those are not like all-inclusive lists of every obsession you could possibly have, but rather some of the more common ones. And I feel like the need to reiterate that these are unwanted thoughts. Like just because you were having thoughts about pedophilia or about picking up a knife and stabbing someone does not mean that you're going to act on those thoughts, right? They're so distressing to you to the point of doing compulsion to cleanse yourself of them. They're so distressing to you because they're not thoughts you want to be having. And so most people are able to like, oh, that was an unpleasant thought, let it pass. With obsessive compulsive disorder, when you have such an unpleasant, distressing thought like that, you start to question what does that mean and what is going to happen because of that. And I must do something to reduce the anxiety and discomfort I have around this thought that I just had. Okay. So what are compulsions? Compulsions, again, are those behaviors or those rituals that you perform in order to decrease your discomfort around the obsessive thought that you had. So most common ones are checking, repeating, reassurance seeking, mental compulsions. So thinking about, like reviewing events that happen in your mind, thinking about them on repeat, praying to prevent harm, counting, counting to a specific number that is a good number, canceling or undoing bad thoughts with a good thought and getting it perfectly. Those are all examples of mental compulsions. Washing and cleaning can be common too. And I think that's one that we commonly associate with OCD. It's like, oh yeah, I have to wash my hands 6 times in a row. And I think that's one that is downplayed without considering the impact that could have on someone's quality of life and ultimately health and safety, right? If someone is washing their hands to the point of skin breakdown and to the point that like they're missing out on other aspects of their life, it's not just like this cute quirk that like, oh, she always has to wash her hands 6 times. It's like this person is consumed by that. And now their hands are bleeding. Anyway, so those are kind of the main gist. You'll also hear of like pure O OCD, which is like when it's primarily obsessions. I think that's what it means again. Um, and there's not necessarily like observable behaviors that go with it, but rather like the mental compulsions and the mental processing of those obsessive thoughts. Okay, I need a breather and a sip of boba. Was no one going to tell me that my earring was in the wrong hole? Didn't notice? Or if you did, very observant. Nice job. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about this OCD cycle. Okay, so let's talk more about OCD as a cycle. So you have this obsessive or intrusive thought that occurs. Oftentimes you assign meaning to that, or meaning is applied to that, and this causes some sort of emotional distress for you, anxiety, disgust, fear. In response to that, you engage in that compulsion, whether it's your avoidance, whether it's the repetitive action, whether it's the checking, the reassurance seeking, whatever that compulsion is, that happens in order to get very short-term relief, which is then negatively reinforcing the initial obsession and the accompanying anxiety that came with it or other distressing experience. So it is this negative reinforcement cycle that the more you engage with those intrusive thoughts, the more you are assigning meaning to it, and the quicker it is for that short-term relief to go away and for you to almost crave or feel like you need additional compulsion to feel okay. So you'll often hear OCD being talked about as a cycle. So oftentimes with treatment, they're really looking, mental health treatment is really looking to intervene in between the obsessive thought and the compulsion. So either delaying or stopping or changing something about the compulsion to give it less power by way of reducing the amount of relief that you get from that, right? So the less effective that compulsion is in reducing your negative experience with the intrusive thought, the less likely you are to return to do that thing in the future. And I think what I've seen a lot of people struggle with is in trying to modify the compulsions, and myself included, we are just really replacing one compulsion with another. So, okay, I know I don't want to be doing constant skin checks anymore. I know that I'm going to stop that. I work really hard to stop that, and I'm not actually processing or coping with those intrusive thoughts and the anxiety that goes with it, but instead, I'm now doing hand washing instead. So anywho. Okay, so now that we've talked about obsessive compulsive disorder as a mental health condition and really described what the difference between obsessions and compulsions are, I want to describe my experience with obsessive compulsive disorder. I guess I'll start with talking about early signs of OCD for me and when I was diagnosed. So, although I was not clinically diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder until I was 21, I believe, I did start showing signs and behaviors at around age 5, and I'm able to now, through my adult lens, look back and recognize so many different stages and phases of my OCD throughout my life. I've had more of a pure O OCD, which I think really delayed my diagnosis because I didn't have a lot of easily recognizable outward behaviors. It was a lot of mental compulsions and reassurance seeking internally and a lot of mental compulsions to help cleanse those thoughts. So I certainly have like no frustration or blame that it took me, you know, that long to reach a diagnosis for me. Because it makes so much sense. Like you don't know what's going on in someone's head. And I didn't have the capacity or the knowledge to understand that what I was experiencing was atypical. Not really, anyway. So some of my early signs, like thinking back, um, I had mentioned kind of that responsibility obsession, constantly feeling like there were certain actions or behaviors that I would do that could result in the demise of usually my parents or my brother. So stepping on cracks was a big one. It was really, really challenging, and I'm laughing because just like thinking it's not funny, it's just coping mechanism. But like thinking back to when there'd be really small tiles with like grout everywhere, I would like walk on a single toe to try and avoid it. And when I accidentally stepped on a crack, um, like panic would ensue. I would like be ferociously apologizing in my head and praying and praying and praying for forgiveness and that this action that I just did didn't result in that. But I would also start preparing that, like, okay, anytime now I'm gonna get a call that my parents have died and it's my fault because I stepped on this thing. Um, so that was one of the earlier things that I remember. Um, I also had number focused obsessions and compulsions where I had to do things in groupings of four because there are four people in my family, and everything I did had to be in multiples of four to ensure that all four of us would stay alive and not be hurt. Um, so when I say everything, I mean everything. And like I had to have a thought exactly the same four times in a row. I had to write a word exactly perfectly four times in a row. And it got to the point where it wasn't just four, but it was multiples of four. And so sometimes it would be, okay, well, four times four, really each four needs its own four to truly ensure the safety of my family. I'm gonna have to now rewrite each word 16 times. Um, so I can remember like in middle school, this was when this number obsession was particularly intense. I can remember one teacher noticing this and he kind of mocked me for it. But it was like the only time I felt like anyone had actually observed that I was struggling. Um, because I would like write through the paper, right? I'm rewriting this thing so many times, and I also couldn't allow my writing to touch either line because it had to be just right. And so I would spend so much time writing and rewriting my assignments, and then it would look bad, right? Like when you write over something 16 times, it becomes hard to read. And like I said, I would rip paper a lot. Um, so I remember my teacher saying, like, what, are you afraid to touch the lines? And I felt terrified that he was on to me, right? And so I remember in that moment thinking, oh my gosh, I can't do that anymore. I have to do something else because like I'm seen in a way that felt dangerous. Um, so I internalized a lot more of the compulsions. I'm like, okay, well, I can't let someone see that, so I have to just be repeating thoughts and words in my head 16 times. So oftentimes I would just be like, I would be physically present somewhere, but I would be engaged in such consistent mental compulsions that I would miss out on so much that was going on in my surroundings. Um, like I would see what time it was, and I'd like every time I looked at the clock, okay, I had to repeat the time. It was 4:07. If it was an odd number, that was bad luck. So then I really had to make sure um I repeated it back in my head perfectly. And it wasn't just like I would view myself writing 417 on repeat for like 16 times. And if I messed it up, I had to start over. And then sometimes it would get to the point where it's like, I can't just write the numbers. I gotta write out FOUR colon ONE colon SEVEN, and again, and again, and again, and again. ONE colon. Nope, I messed up. Okay, start again. FOUR colon. And again, none of this could be externalized. I didn't want anyone to see the things I was doing. I didn't know it was wrong, but I knew it was weird enough that I didn't want to be perceived doing it. Oh, so the numbers were freaking exhausting. And I'm getting very exhausted and dysregulated talking about this. So I'm going to take a quick breather and a break. Like I feel my heart pounding. So we'll just take just a real quick break here and I'll come back. Promise. Okay, so I've decided I'm not going to relive and tell every obsession and compulsion I've had because that's more than I want to deal with and can handle at this moment. But I think it's really important for me to touch on the scrupulosity because that was a big one. So I was baptized Catholic. I grew up mostly like a creaster, and if you're Catholic, you know what I mean. Like we didn't go to church that often, but we'd go for major holidays and I'd go with friends and what have you. But I was more of like a passive Catholic participant, I guess. But as part of like my coming of age and exploring my identity as an adult, I decided to pursue my Catholic faith further, and I went through YNIA. No, what was it called? RCIA. I can't even remember what it was called. I think that's what it was. Which is basically like adult First Communion. And like catechism. So anyway, from around the age 5 or 6 up until I sought treatment at like 22, I had a lot of obsessive thoughts about purity, about morality, and about living a sin-free life. And it was hard. It was hard for me for a long time to tangle out what was like Catholic beliefs and being a good Catholic girl, versus what was the OCD. So, whenever I would have a thought or say something that I could perceive in that moment of being somewhat unclean, like it could be as simple as thinking, "Oh, that person kind of annoyed me how they said it like that." Like very benign things that I can now see as very benign things that I would think, "Oh my gosh, that's me judging." And that judgment is a sin. And now I would engage in the compulsion of repetitive, structured prayer until I no longer believed in that thought and sought forgiveness for having that unclean, impure thought. Um, so I had this prayer that I said in my head repeatedly for like 15 years. And there were many years in my life where I got very little to no sleep because I would get stuck in the loop of trying to say the prayer perfectly in my head according to the numbers that I had assigned, that I couldn't fall asleep until my work around that had been done. And I could never get it perfectly, right? Never, ever get it perfect. And so the times that I would fall asleep, I would wake up with immense guilt thinking, oh my God, I never got to finish that perfectly. And now I'm going to hell and I've killed my family. So I tried to engage in prayer that wasn't that same prayer, that repetitive prayer, but I really struggled with finding a way to pray that didn't translate into the compulsions. So my compulsive prayer was something like, oh, dear God, God, please let me, my mom, my dad, and my brother. And then as I got older, there was a whole list of other people that I would add in, my dog, my cats, my friend. Oh, I paused. I gotta start over. Dear God, please have me, my mom, my dad, my brother be absolutely positively fine. Please let us be healthy and happy and live Oh, I messed up. I gotta start over. Please, God, please. Please, dear God. Please, dear God, please. Let me, my mom, my dad, my brother be happy, healthy. Nope, I messed it up. Please, dear God, please. Let me, my mom, my dad, my brother live happy, healthy, long lives. Please let us be safe and not die. And I I am so grateful, God, for the life that you've given me, for the love of my family. Please, God, please keep us safe. And if I ever got to the end, it was in Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, I got one perfect iteration. 15 more to go. Wow, I've never said that out loud. It's always been internal. Um, well, I'm glad it was, because it's a lot harder to say it perfectly out loud than it is in your mind. And perfect was such an unachievable thing as well, right? You were always striving to do something perfectly, but it was a moving target. What does perfect look like? So, scrupulosity, real big, real big interference in my life. Um, yeah. Okay. So, as I got older, so teenage years to my early 20s, my obsessions became increasingly more health focused. Um, intense fears and intrusive thoughts about undiagnosed, unknown diseases or conditions, and intense responsibility around feeling like I had to catch those in advance, that I had to be responsible for them. And so that has led to a whole host of different debilitating compulsions that have interfered with my early adult life to the point of, yeah, complete dysfunction and like not wanting to live, for sure. So many times the thought was like, not existing is so much easier than continuing to exist like this. Like, it got me to a dark place. I can't tell you the number of times I have grieved and lived out diseases, treatments that have gone wrong, deaths that I haven't actually experienced physically in this life, but in my mind in such vivid detail and with such intensity that grief was real. Like, I truly, truly believed that I had so many different terminal illnesses, and that I wasn't doing the right things to be able to stop it unless I was constantly going to the doctor, constantly getting tests, constantly seeking reassurance, constantly Googling, constantly doing body checks. And even so, it would never be enough because my ultimate fear, the thing that I truly believed I had, was going to kill me anyway. So, a big underlying theme amongst all of the obsessions and compulsions I've had throughout my life, and I have not gotten into all of them. Like I said, this is very intense for me, and that's what I feel like, that's the extent I feel like I can share today. Um, but a very common theme was responsibility and guilt. Immense guilt constantly. The absence of an intrusive thought filled me with such dread and such guilt because it meant that I was vulnerable to some threat that I wasn't aware of. So as long as I was engaging in such distressing, intrusive thoughts or the compulsions related to them, then I was somehow protecting myself and others. And so as long as I was perpetually miserable, it was okay. And so fleeting moments of like peace and joy were fraught with shame, absolute shame. So that's a hefty belief to work through. Okay, taking a break. So I want to talk a little bit about treatment I've sought and mental health recovery. So with obsessive compulsive disorder, um, as with most mental health conditions, the goal is to be in a state of recovery. Most mental health conditions are chronic or lifelong, meaning you will have to deal with it at some capacity um, at different points of your entire life. I don't know if it's possible for someone to like fully not have the thing anymore. Like I know you can be in a place where you're not presenting enough symptoms to be like clinically diagnosable, but I view that for me as like I'm in a state of recovery, but I'm not recovered. Um, so some treatment I've um, had like traditional CBT therapy and what they call ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, I think it is. I've gone through intensive ERP, which is exposure response prevention treatment. Pardon me. Currently working through the internal family systems IFS model. So a lot of talk therapy and medication. Tried a lot of different medications. Was on medication before I had the OCD diagnosis, so I was on a lot of ineffective treatment regimes prior to that. My understanding is with OCD, it responds really well to antidepressants, but at a very high level. So, like the highest level that is therapeutically appropriate, and sometimes even higher, is what's needed for OCD. So I was on a low dose, several low dose antidepressants for a while, which really, it's so funny. I hear this all the time, and I felt this myself where I was like, I don't really know if it's helping or not. Like, maybe I don't think things are worse. But then, like, once I was on a medication that was actually helping, I was like, oh my gosh. It's ridiculous to me that I like wasn't sure before because it's so obvious when when it was actually working. Um, but medication, a combination of medication, for me, though exposure response prevention therapy is very, very, very intense, and for some people can be a traumatic experience because it's all about exposing yourself to your greatest fears and those intrusive thoughts and not engaging in your prior coping mechanisms of the compulsions. Um, I do believe for me, it was a crucial part of getting to the point where I am now. And I think the most important takeaway for me was really just acceptance around like the lack of control I really do have in my life. And that helped me start to unpack a lot of the guilt I had. Um, because if I don't always feel so responsible for controlling uncontrollable thoughts and sources of anxiety in my life, then I didn't have so much guilt around not stopping them or missing signs or cues that there was some danger, right? So though I still find myself reverting to compulsions unconsciously from time to time, I'm at the place where I am much more able to identify it as such and feel like I can safely disengage from that without a debilitating sense of guilt and fear that I am allowing myself vulnerability to harm and threat. So I think those are the main takeaways I've had from a lot of my therapy, but I will say that I am a person who's experiencing a state of recovery in OCD. But I'm not a person who's not OCD anymore. It's still it's been such a huge component of how I've developed, how my thoughts and my cognitive processes have been. And I think that if I didn't have any other conditions or identities, that like my OCD and my experience of it from being so young has irrevocably changed my neural working, that I would identify 100% as neurodivergent with that alone. And that is how I started identifying as neurodivergent, only knowing about the OCD. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate you for listening. I so appreciate the platform for these kinds of stories to be heard and um, to explore them for myself. In a big way, it's therapeutic to reflect on my experience and name it for what it was. Um, and also, I hope I can help provide some hope for those who are amidst the really intense, all-consuming cycles, knowing that like it freaking sucks, and you are so incredibly strong for continuing day in and day out, and it does get better. It really does. It really does.